Welcome to the Playlist Podcast, where we talk to artists, designers, engineers, musicians, athletes, all kinds of people from all walks of life to discover a little bit about them and the video games that influence them along the way. Today, we're talking to artist, musician, and composer Sam Shepard. Sam makes music under the name Parade Music, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Music, and the preferred music platform of your choice. And this is a really great chat, really focused on soundtracks for video games, some of Sam's picks, what it really takes to make a world come to life using sound design and music. And we also touch on, some of the pros and cons of being an indie artist in 2025. I'm Benjamin Dorr. This is Playlist Episode 5. Let's do it. Hello, Sam.
Hello, Benjamin.
This is a weird scenario for us to be in, I guess, because, we're related, we're cousins, first cousins, and we have done a lot of stuff together over the years. And I think this felt like a really good time to talk about music and then talk about video games. And, you are my go-to source for uncovering things that have fallen under the radar, but not just things that have fallen under the radar. Like, you are a great purveyor of popular culture, I would say. So super excited to have you on here and talk about music, games, and everything in between.
It's beautiful hearing that from you, by the way, just as a side note, because 100%, when I was like 15, 14, I stole all of my taste from you 100%. So you are the cause of all of this, and also a fantastic source of rampant nepotism, which is how I'm here.
I really appreciate that. And I guess this is the first Nepo cast that we've done. I would say, most people who know your music would know your Parade Music project, which is a band that you have recorded material for quite a while. Can you give us a little bit more about Parade Music, like what the genre, and
certainly I can. So I started Parade Music, I must be about 8 years ago now. So I was in a couple of bands. I think at the time I was in 7 or 8 projects with a bunch of different musicians that I know, because I'm always saying yes to people who are like, hey, I want to start a band. What instrument do you play? Oh, I don't play an instrument. I just want to start a band, and kind of go from there. But eventually I started writing a bunch of music that all of my bands categorically hated. They hated playing it. They hated listening to it. They hated every part of it. So I was like, you know what? Okay, fine. I will take my music and I will do it myself. And that became the first couple of Parade Music demos. I released them on Bandcamp in 2017. There was the Oolong Mixer mixtape, the Mime Erotica mixtape, and the Peppermint Headache mixtape, which I think were all released within a week of each other, because I was just pumping out hundreds of songs at the time. I have a habit every time I get really, really bored with like my job or just anything else I'm doing, I become extremely prolific and just pumping out music endlessly. So from there, I started taking it a bit more seriously. A couple of the bands I was in sort of fizzled out. And around the pandemic, I got talking with you. And we talked about the idea of like, hey, I have thousands of songs here, but I don't have anyone to like record them. I don't have any artwork for them or anything. So if I wanted to do this properly and I wanted to start really, really dedicating myself to this, then it would be great if we could start collaborating. And so we did. You did the artwork for my second album, which was Opulence. My friend Felix was gracious enough to give me the art for the first one, Oolong Mixer. And we've been steadily releasing music over the past couple of months, sometimes with collaborators, sometimes with just myself.
It's really interesting, looking at that whole process, because, you had a lot of material, a few years back, and then slowly going through the process of working out that, hey, we could actually release it. And get it distributed on multiple platforms and do our own kind of low-key marketing for it, and starting to kind of understand how absolutely challenging it is for indie artists in the space
in the past few years.
Really? Yeah, it is not worth it. Like for anyone who is like looking to be a musician, like professionally, quit immediately. It's a terrible idea. Even if you succeed, you still fail. Like I am lucky enough that I'm in the situation where I have a lot of people who are helping me, and I also have my other job. Like I co-own a agency, and that's where I get my money. So I'm in a space where I'm fine. I can lose money on anything that I'm doing, but it's just a cool thing that I get to do, and I get to help out artists around me to get their music professionally released and stuff like that. But in terms of actually making money on this, it is absolutely I'm in the red.
Yeah. I mean, I even think for huge artists who get billions of streams, I mean, even their revenue, when you start to break down the numbers, is not huge. And then you have touring artists, and touring is expensive, and it's complicated, I would say, to be making music in 2025. And it's been complicated for a long, long time.
I think about that for bands, because I really like a lot of bands that will have like 11, 12 members, like Mother Falcon or The World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die. Your bands that have dozens of members throughout their career. And they're getting paid the same amount as someone who is just playing an acoustic guitar on stage by themselves. And you think, like, that amount of money, no matter how much money you're getting even from touring, once you split it 11 ways, plus all of the touring, plus all the promotional costs and everything, it is a extremely depressing number.
Yeah. And I think that's why so many artists now have their businesses unto themselves. You know, when you think about pop stars like Rihanna, who's like Fenty, or, Drake, who is Ogo and Nocta, and like, they're not just an artist who releases music, they're an artist that releases, clothing or makeup, or, they're appearing in video games and they're doing live streams. I mean, Snoop Dogg is a great example of that. And, I worked with Snoop Dogg on Need for Speed No Limits kind of early on. I mean, Snoop has his own agency dedicated to everything Snoop Dogg. And I think he's the original artist that put himself in so many different lanes. He's done kids' books. He produced porn. He's done clothing. He's been in multiple video games. He live streams on Twitch. He's being really prolific in music. And then you've got like the detours, I think, with Martha Stewart, like hosting cooking shows and really, like, Snoop is absolutely everywhere and kind of means different things to different people. And he's still kind of kept himself in the zeitgeist across demographics. It's incredible to kind of see stuff like that. But that seems to be the way that artists have to be, because it's virtually impossible to make a living purely from selling music alone.
Yeah, entirely agreed. I mean, as you said, especially with a lot of rappers, there will be this conversation about the idea that the only way to make money as a rapper is to start your own label and you're getting a bunch of other rappers. It ends up sort of like a pyramid scheme. Because obviously, even with Drake and all of that, that came from Young Money and Lil Wayne and everything. So it's just the people need to keep building this empire of things because otherwise they're just not making any money from what they do. As much as they might be, getting millions of sales on albums or millions of streams monthly, at the end of the day, so much money is being pumped into that to make that happen that the logistics of it end up being an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, 100%. How would you like to talk about the first game?
If I was going to pick a absolute favorite in terms of soundtrack and sound design, it would have to be Silent Hill 3. Which I feel has gone completely underappreciated up until very recently. Like, I've noticed more and more that a couple of tracks from it have started to be used by a lot of YouTubers and things as background music. But aside from that, I feel like Silent Hill 3 really didn't get the dues it properly deserved, because it was massively overshadowed by Silent Hill 2 being the greatest horror game of all time. Which, yeah, it probably is, but I'm still salty about the fact that Silent Hill 1, 3, and 4 don't get as much credit as they deserve. I will make a caveat there. Silent Hill 4, incredible music, truly exceptional vibes, wonderful soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka. I don't even care that it's not fun to play and it's a terrible game to actually go through and experience. Every single part of it is so stylish and so like perfectly suited to the vibe it was going for that I can't hate it.
Yeah. And what is it about the Silent Hill 3 sound design and soundtrack in particular? Like, what is it about it that elevates it beyond your other entries in the series and the genre itself?
I think a lot of it comes down to the protagonist they went with Heather Mason. It's the one game in the series, in the initial 4, that has a female teen protagonist, and that really fed into the way that they used the soundscapes and the sonic palettes that they had been using for the first 2 games. Because as a successor to the first game, you still have a lot of the very industrial sounds. Like Akira Yamaoka was very inspired by early Nine Inch Nails and Depeche Mode, and your like 80s and 90s artists like that. But if you listen to the Silent Hill 1 soundtrack, it is bordering on not being music. It is the sounds of dentist drills. It is like very Einstürzende Neubauten sort of stuff. You're like a bunch of nails in a bucket just being ground down with industrial equipment. But seeing that fused in with a lot of the sounds that were very popular around the late 90s and early 2000s that someone like Heather would be listening to, you're like the Massive Attack stuff, the trip hop like Portishead, Tricky, that sort of thing. Having those 2 worlds connect creates a soundscape and a vibe that feels just like perfectly at home with the very tranquil sounds of Silent Hill 2 and the incredibly discordant sounds of Silent Hill 1, which, in my opinion, makes it the best for the fact that it hits the menacing tone while still being an incredibly listenable, like almost like trip-hop prog album in and of itself. Like, I think the best soundtracks are ones that you can listen to the soundtrack without playing the game and still fully understand the vibe that it is going for. And in Silent Hill 3, that vibe is pure isolation, which I think trip hop is a perfect avenue for.
You bring up a really good point that I would say probably back in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of kind of licensed soundtracks or soundtracks that brought in elements from wider culture into the gaming space to create that connection. And it was a great discovery tool as well, and I think, I can probably bring up more movie references here. Obviously, EA had the Def Jam games like Def Jam Icon and was a Fight for New York, which was an insane level of that, where you had actual artists in those games, licensed soundtracks. But EA has been a great kind of purveyor of licensed soundtracks for a long time, probably more so than any other video game publisher. But going back to kind of really personal games or games that had a story identity like Silent Hill and having those influences in there, I think is a really special thing, not just for the experience, but for a gateway of discovery. That's because, there was no Spotify and there was no Apple Music and it was MTV and things like that or NME, but it was harder to discover things. So you kind of found something, you liked it, and then you kind of dove into the genre, and it probably, the Silent Hill series probably helped people create identities for themselves in such a dramatic way, given the time period they were released. And to your point, having those influences in there as well.
Yeah, entirely agreed. That's a fantastic way of putting it. Because I think of the work of someone like Akira Yamaoka or Kota Hoshino, who did the Evergrace soundtrack and a lot of the early FromSoft stuff, which I'm sure I will talk about more in this. I think about them almost in the realm of plunderphonics, like just taking sounds from everywhere, shoving them together in ways that don't seem like they should work, and creating these borderline soundscapes which bring in a lot of what is going on in the underground culture of the time in a way that like helps people to understand on a like base level the things that they are going to love. Like, I can say that so much of not just my taste in music, but my taste in art was shaped by the music of Akira Yamaoka and the aesthetics of games like Silent Hill or Kuon, a lot of the survival horror that was coming out at the time, because it was my Rosetta Stone for everything else that I ended up really, really loving. Because games like that, and especially soundtracks like that, wear a lot of their influences on their sleeve. Like there is a very clear identity that they are looking to evoke. And a lot of the time that is blending in the sounds of either popular culture, if you're going for modern day stuff like Silent Hill 3, or your like traditional Japanese music in the case of Kuon. And bringing that in with the sounds of like ethereal horror that ended up becoming your like statement pieces of 90s alternative. And so you can listen to those soundtracks and you can hear the tapestry of everything that came before them so clearly, but in a way that as time goes on more and more and nostalgia sort of takes over a lot of those sounds, feels all the more impactful because they almost end up being like time capsules for a lot of the things that alternative music was shaping into at the time. And I feel like Akira Yamaoka especially, and Kota Hoshino, maybe a bit less Kota Hoshino because I feel like he still hasn't gotten his dues, but definitely Akira Yamaoka was so on the pulse of what was happening in like alternative music, industrial music, ambient music at the time, that going back and listening to that, it is so interesting seeing how much of that ended up pulling through and what people are really passionate about from that time period.
Yeah. And I also think, Japanese history with noise music like Merzbow and like Boredom, also cinema like Tetsuo and Iron Man is a great example of industrial kind of low budget filmmaking that they're all touch points of a similar theme. That was a very Japanese statement and incredibly brutal and unafraid in a way that their Western counterparts didn't really get so much at the time. But that influence, to your point, kind of really bled into like Nine Inch Nails and, other, especially, I would say, early 2000s horror films that were in the US started to really pull those influences into Western culture as well. Japan really did have such an incredible ongoing impact in video games in so many different ways because of that loop.
Yeah. And I also just will say that it is very interesting looking at, especially 90s, like the 90s alternative scene when it comes to Japan as well, and how that shaped in entirely different ways from in the West. Like you have these two different break-off points for alternative, like heavy hardcore music that kind of blended together in the West. Like Nirvana became the biggest band in the world for your grunge and that entire scene, which kind of shot a lot of bands, even like the Melvrons and a lot of the noisier stuff into the mainstream. While in Japan, like from an outside perspective, it seems like there were the two big offshoots of like the metal scene becoming very, very clean and very, very like well produced, and some of the huge music, like especially in Visual Kai. But you also have this separate scene going on in like the garage scene with bands like Number Girl and Guitar Vader and stuff like that, where early Weezer was getting really big in those areas. Well, where things just were so much grittier and so much more intense than a lot of the stuff that was happening in like the alt rock scene of the 90s in America and the grunge scene and all of that. Where you can look back even now at a lot of like Number Girl stuff and once again Guitar Vader and still think like this is really intense music, like just incredibly visceral, but like beautiful music. And you can see that really pull through in a lot of the stuff from the early 2000s, especially, which was going for that very like underground punk aesthetics mixed with like hip hop culture and a lot of other things. Like I feel like bands like Nirvana blending with your artists like Nerd at the time really fused into a lot of the stuff like Tetsuya Nomura was doing, for example, with Kingdom Hearts and The World Ends With You. And seeing that transition in what the primary underground sound was of video games is a like really fascinating transition to see.
What is your second game that you would like to discuss?
I will talk about another soundtrack that I am very passionate about, which is the soundtracks of Evergrace and Evergrace 2. They're both early FromSoft games from the PS2 era. They were both composed by Kota Hoshino, who is mainly known for the Armored Core soundtracks, also by From Software. I am going to make the case that the Evergrace and Evergrace 2 soundtracks are the two best soundtracks in video game history. And they are
a bold statement. Yeah.
I entirely agree. And look, there are other soundtracks on my list that I think about more, that I probably listen to more in my life. Like the Katamari Damacy soundtrack is one of the greatest pieces of like Shibuya Kai music ever released, and stuff like that. Or the music of like Saroni Poji, sorry, is like also fantastic from Romania. But in terms of music that you cannot find anywhere else, like a singular musical experience, the Evergrace 2, otherwise known as Forever Kingdom in North America soundtrack, is unmatched for just pure weird vibes and weird energy. It was considered to be one of the worst soundtracks ever, like around the time it was released. People just had no concept of what they were listening to. I've looked at a lot of reviews from around the time, from like old like forum posts and stuff. People hated it, and they were wrong. Koyo Hoshino is what I aspire to be in terms of an untrained musical ear. Someone who doesn't seem to have a concept of what things are meant to sound like, and so they're just doing their best interpretation of what something should sound like. And for Evergrace in particular, like even more so than Armored Core, any work that they did on the Dark Souls soundtrack or the Elden Ring soundtrack or anything, that sound could not be more fitting. It blends together so many different things that you could only really consider to be world music mixed with like frog music, mixed with like ethereal ambient music, all blending together in this way that almost feels like dream logic. And when I'm looking at composers that I am exceedingly jealous of in terms of their ability to craft music and craft sounds, I'm always looking to people who are making things that it's not just that I can't make them, it's that even after listening to what they're doing again and again and again, I can't work out how they came to the decisions that they did when crafting the thing that they ended up making. Like, there is not a road I can imagine to creating the Forever Kingdom soundtrack. And that is what makes it so interesting to me. Like, I listen to it on the regular, far more so than I think about the game Forever Kingdom. Like, the game Forever Kingdom is good. It's a fun little PS2 game and an underrated classic, in my opinion. But that soundtrack is earnestly my favorite progressive album, maybe even my favorite instrumental album, period, for the fact that there is not a single reference point that I can put in place for any other music that sounds like that to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because obviously, the traditional process of scoring a game is you would bring the composer in early and they would look at the art and they would test things out, and then the music recorded gets broken into stems and gets kind of homogenized in a way to an extent, depending on the kind of game experience. And so it is a real feat to be able to have an auteur take on music outside of, that game is not the vision of one. It's not an auteur game necessarily, right? But to have the music be so distinct and those risks taken would take an incredible amount of faith between the games director and the composer. And it doesn't happen very often. Music is, I think now, and I'm coming at this from probably a little bit more of the commercial indie side, there's a lot of user testing and debate now, and a lot of a little bit of trepidation when it comes to, game scores. So to have it be so bold is really a rarity.
Agreed. It's one of the things that draws me to a lot of independent video games. And I don't mean the commercial independent. I mean like freeware that feels like it should be a virus on your computer type beats from like, especially the early to mid 2000s. I'm a really big fan of the RPG horror genre that became big with a lot of like early video game streamers. But stuff like Corpse Party, The Witch's House, Yume Nikki is probably the one that people most fondly remember. The Crooked Man, Miseo. I could go on forever. Most of my experience growing up with video games was me playing these games that felt like they should be illegal for me to download, that were made by like one person in their basement for the PC-98, which is a like computer system that I obviously wouldn't have had access to, had no context for. I now own one that's in the other room, specifically because I'm such a big fan of that sort of era of gaming. But especially looking at the soundtracks for a lot of those games, like if you look at stuff like Touhou Project, if you look at stuff like Corpse Party, these are series that were being made by one person who didn't necessarily have the best grasp of everything that they were doing. They just knew, I'm making a game, that game needs music, so I'm going to create that music. Or this game needs graphics, so I guess I need to work out how to make graphics. And from that like primordial stew of creativity, you end up getting a lot of the things that I find most interesting and that I try and bring into a lot of what I do, which is coming at art from the perspective of someone who has no context for what that art form actually is meant to be. Like, which is why Kota Hoshino's work really appeals to me, because it feels like we are seeing like a different genetic route of what music could have been and what the creation of soundtracks could have been, which obviously never took off because everyone seems to hate it except for me. I'm not a big fan of auteur theory, because I believe that just inherently, obviously, there's always going to be a large amount of people that have their imprint on a film, and giving someone, one person all of the credit is convenient, but obviously doesn't actually connect with the real experience of making things with a large cost.
But I think depending though, so to interject with that, like I do think, if you want to go truly auteur, there are, lots of examples of people who have kind of shot the thing and started the thing and kept it indie and done the music. But I think holistically, the idea of a director getting all the credit is, yeah, it absolutely takes a village, but there are I think the examples that really do cross over with indie games, there are examples that are pure, like I did all of it, right? In games, and I did all of it. And they're really unique experiences because the person's like, in a way, there's no fucks given in terms of compromise. And it's not that they don't care about what the audience thinks, but they're not having to, I think to me, like working, and I've worked in like on the film side, I've worked on the game side, and it is a series of compromises along the way. Right. So people can start with this great thing, but due to time or due to testing or due to opinion, like the thing changes quite a bit. And the things I probably love, like you, are the things that I can see that the person didn't compromise. And even if I don't fully enjoy the experience, I 100% respect that they didn't have to compromise on the thing, because that's how great art gets made. I'm not saying that art can't get made the other way, but it's a different kind of art, right? It's a commercial kind of art that you're working towards.
I entirely agree. And I do genuinely think that your art without compromise can be some of the most beautiful things that are ever created. I think a good example of that is, like, in terms of not necessarily auteur, but in terms of just having large-scale experiences with no compromise, is Demon's Souls, a game that was sort of meant to fail. Like, when you have a project where, from a commercial standpoint, everyone has mostly given up on the project before it releases. You end up not really having that many notes that can be given because it's like considered unsalvageable. It's the same with Silent Hill 1. Your Team Silent was a group of people who were underperforming in other areas. Konami wanted a Resident Evil clone, and by about halfway through, they had given up on the project. We're just like, yeah, do whatever you want. We just need a horror game at the end of this. And you get one of the most iconic, like seminal works of the survival horror genre. Same with Demon Souls. It was meant to be just a title for the PS1 to ride, sorry, not the PS1, the PS3 to ride off the coattails of the release of Oblivion and like the Elder Scrolls series. And obviously that didn't happen. The people at Sony absolutely hated it from day one and thought that it was a terrible idea to release outside of Japan. But it ended up spawning the Dark Souls series, which is one of the greatest gaming series of all time for sadistic, lonely weirdos like me.
Not even just the series, like it's a genre that bled way beyond the series, like the Souls-like. And so many Souls-like games. There was a period where everything was a Souls-like that was coming out. But the fact that it bled anything that can spawn a genre unto itself is incredible because it's this self-feeding art form that reverberates,
Exactly. And also to add on to that, anything that can survive becoming a genre in and of itself is incredible. Like, the Lies of P is maybe like the one thing that's come out where people have been like, okay, this is good enough to be a proper Souls-like game. But it's amazing to see so many different studios try and take a hit at creating a Souls-like experience and mostly fail, like mostly kind of land just with a thud on impact because there is a certain level of esoteric fascination with Dark Souls and with Elden Ring and with Bloodborne, and even going back to their earlier titles like the Kingsfield series, which I absolutely love, despite the fact that, once again, just a terrible series to play. From a experiential perspective, one of the greatest experiences I've ever had with a video game is Kingsfield: The Ancient City, the Lost Kingsfield game to come out on the PS2. But those games are so deep with a love and appreciation for things that come from outside of the world of video games that a lot of just video game creators who are trying to create their own Souls-like, they're coming at it from a love of the thing, not a love of the influences that went before the thing. Like, I often think about this in terms of the idea of a genre of music being dead. Like, you hear a lot of the time, like, punk is dead, grunge is dead, that idea. I think what a lot of people mean when they say that blank is dead is that rather than being inspired by the things that originally inspired by it, it starts to be inspired by itself. And it's why the idea of creating a Dark Souls-like experience based on a love of Dark Souls doesn't really work, because you're trying to like reverse engineer something that is so arcane in its very presentation that it's really hard to get there.
And lastly, like, I know you've been working on a visual novel with some friends for a while, and you've not only been contributing music for it, but character and story and things like that. What can you tell us about the visual novel, and what are the kind of plans for release?
Certainly. So this is a project that we have been kind of ideating back and forth for a while. I have a group of friends, many of which work with me and collaborate on stuff for Cigarette Sweetheart. So it's a little art collective of people who are all like really passionate about just different artistic mediums. And we have been planning a couple of different visual novels. We're all big fans of the visual novel genre. And the one that we are currently working on, which already has the foundations of it completed, all of the art, a lot of the music, a lot of the writing is already done. Everything is called Ferval Midnight Sessions. As stated, I did the music and quite with the character writing and everything. But we have a team of fantastic artists, fantastic background designers, and everything, just working together to craft a very strange singular experience that is kind of a dating sim, but not. We're looking to release it on like itch.io and Steam once it's properly done, and I'm also looking for what is the strangest way that I can put together a soundtrack, like an official soundtrack release for it. Once again, it brings in a lot of like plunderphonics and a lot of trip hop stuff from my perspective. I've taken a lot of like early recordings of Gregorian chants and looped them into music, kind of like early like boom bap stuff and trip hop stuff, which I'm a big fan of. I really like using Gregorian chants and church music when I'm doing remixes and stuff like that. So given that there are some biblical undertones to the work that we're putting together, it has been a really fun time to really just pull out the playbook in terms of, you know, what I can get from a group of nuns in the 1940s and what I can do to make that a fantastic, like, hip hop, like donut style beat.
I would 100% listen to a trip hop album that you made, because you made, you know, the intro music to this podcast, which is definitely, the brief was Glitch J Dilla. And J Dilla is not, you know, really trip hop, but, you know, I was a massive trip hop fan back in the day. And I think my favorite trip hop album of all time is Melly God by Tricky, because I think it came a bit later in Tricky's evolution, before Tricky went vegan and stopped doing drugs, but right at the end of, it was probably in a very bad place for him. But I like it because it has such great textural sounds and it's very deconstructed and it doesn't feel quite as commercial as his earlier stuff did, which was beautiful, but it was still in the trappings of like your Portisheads and, you know, Jeff Barrow kind of produced stuff. What is your favorite trip hop release of all time?
Okay, this is going to make it sound like I have incredibly boring taste, but I latched onto a trip hop album very early in my life, and still to this day, it's the one that I come back to again and again and again, and it is Massive Attack's Mezzanine, like with the song like Angel, and so like in terms of the very clean like Y2K sounding trip hop music, it is the perfect music for most occasions. Like there are very few times in my life where if I put on Mezzanine in the background, it doesn't feel like the perfect background music for that thing. It's not something that I sit there and like put on the vinyl record and snap my fingers and really just enjoy for the sake of enjoying all the time. But it's something that I could have on in the background for my entire life and be entirely fine. It is a beautifully composed piece of like British pop music from the 90s. Or is that, I think that might be early 2000s.
I reckon it's early 2000s. And I would put a lot of money on that. There are many, many Gen Z kids who were conceived to the sounds of Mezzanine.
And you know what?
Yeah, because you're right about it. It's very clean, but it's also incredibly bassy and sensual. And it's its own thing. Like it's not like Portishead. Like there are definitely different flavors with that genre. And I feel that was its most optimized commercial, but not commercial. Like it wasn't, like it was doing its own thing. And for me, like Blue Lines is my favorite Massive Attack album. And then like Unfinished Sympathy is like one of my favorite songs of all time. And it has that incredible music video that David Lynch directed with the one shot, black and white. It's Massive Attack are incredible.
Yeah. And like, there's a lot of really fantastic trip hop out there. I think that it's a genre that often gets stifled by bands like Portishead and Massive Attack, kind of setting out the blueprint too perfectly for it. So it's hard for people to really branch out from it. But your stuff like Lamb, like Uncle, even like some of the like more trip hoppy like Royksop stuff and things like that, Thievery Corporation. I'm not as much into Thievery Corporation, and that's mainly just because I haven't really like delved into it too deeply.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there are some fantastic bands from that era that really, alongside a lot of the techno and rave and drum and bass that was happening at the time, ended up being some of my favorite sounds when it comes to like early Y2K aesthetics for video games, especially racing games. Like I feel like that was like the peak era for racing music was the stuff that we inspired by a lot of the trip hop and drum and bass stuff that was coming out of like Britain and Europe at the time.
And also techno, like when you think about like Midnight Club 2, like the main venue music was Derek May, and it was this time that I think what killed trip hop inevitably was the commercialization and the licensing. Like it was just so saturated in the market that it kind of killed its cool, and then the people that were making it were kind of stopped taking drugs and cleaned up their act. And then it kind of all got like, it got washed out a bit. But if I think of a genre that is probably due a comeback, that will cycle back around, it'll be trip hop. I guarantee you. That's the next evolution of Y2K.
I agree. It's a very interesting tracking just electronic music trends in general when it comes to that, because you can see how the rest of the wider world and the rest of the wider artistic space really impacts what is like super popular in the underground for electronic music more than anything else. Like I think that electronic music often doesn't get its dues for being on like the pulse of what everything else that's going on in media and in art and just in the public zeitgeist. Truly 100%. Like I was a big fan of like hyperpop in like the early hyperpop scene with like bubblegum bass and deconstructed house and stuff like that. And when you think about the period for hyperpop, like 100 gecs or like the early Hannah Diamond stuff, or even the stuff that Charlie XCX was doing with Cuisine.
So Ian,
yeah, absolutely, Sophie. I'm glad that Sophie is still getting a lot of love and praise for their work.
Well, I mean, Charlie is obviously a big supporter of, Sophie's work and it kind of gets their name in the dialogue. I thought pop is weird because I think it's not dead like in the way trip hop died out, but it is evolving at a weird rate, And I think 100 gecs has still got like mileage in their creative output. And Charlie with Brat, for example, very much a hyperpop album.
Deeply. I also just think that for a lot of the early, like hyperpop, even though it feels like a bit of a gimmick genre, in general, it's something that's always evolving. And the artists that are really doing fantastic things from that genre are the ones that really expanded out, not the exact sound of what hyperpop was, but the methodology. Like your pandemic era and like the early 2020s was the perfect time for that style of music where everyone was really latching onto a lot of like Y2K and girly pop and like even your scene core and stuff like that was having a resurgence with this sort of like MySpace revival era. But we're not really in that now. Like that is a thing that kind of came around. There are different things that people are latching onto in the underground. And the people who have really managed to keep things going and keep trends moving are the ones that have seen that shifting tide and created that into what they do. Which I think that Charlie XCX did really well with 360, essentially creating the ultimate like love letter to a lot of your like 90s house and things like that, from the perspective of a very introspective album that is also just very, very plastic and very, very like danceable.
Yeah, and I think the remix album, the Brat, I completely forget the title of it, but the remix album that came out, when you look at the artists that were involved, people like John Hopkins on, working with, I'm going to pull a name that I might have here, but I think there might be Robin on there as well. Like very, very broad influences remixing those tracks. And John Hopkins is not the kind of person you would think of associated with Charlie XCX.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I believe on the Robin track as well, they had Young Lean. So just like bringing in a lot of the trendsetters for a lot of the stuff that was happening during the 2010s. Like Robin huge influence on where a lot of dance pop ended up going. And Young Lean and Drain Gang and Sad Boys and all of that really taking over what people consider to be like internet music and the sound of, I want to say the sound of 4chan, but I mean that as a good thing. And it's really hard to bring up 4chan positivity in the same sentence.
I think I remember hearing an interview with Charlie where she talked about Luffy, he was on Ed Banger, like that French rapper.
Yeah.
And, and that is very much of the period as well. And just getting a melting pot of culture and remixing it, I think, is into something new it's a beautiful thing. But
did they do Pop the Glock? Pop the Glock, you pop trout. Oh my God, great track. They're still touring. I actually looked them up pretty recently. Yeah. Not necessarily the most hi-fi live performance ever, but I'm glad that we're getting a lot of that very I want to call it girly pop sort of stuff there, but there's definitely a better term for it. But Millionaires are back. They're doing Warped Tour and stuff like that. And I'm really thrilled seeing a lot of that music get the dues it deserves, and now that it's separated from a genre that truly hated their existence.
Where can people find you on the internet? And do you have anything you would like to plug?
You can find me on Spotify and wherever you enjoy music. I am under the name Parade Music. I also work under fantasy.exe and _vaguely existing. You can find me on Instagram. Probably the most common one that I use is at fantasy.exe band. On Instagram, but I also have a Parade Music one, fantasy.exe one, Cigarette Sweetheart Records one. Hunt me down, find my home address. Just do whatever you can to find me and give me your views on the Evergrace soundtrack. In terms of plugging things, really have anything to plug right now. I'm working on new music. A couple of months ago, I released a true track for fantasy.exe, which is on streaming everywhere, and I'm working on some more Parade Music stuff, so stay tuned for that.
Thanks so much for listening. You've been listening to Playlist, and this is a podcast produced by the 3000s with intro music by Sam Shepard and also produced by myself, Benjamin Dorr. If you would like updates on the show, you can follow us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with links in the show notes below. And if you would like more content, please remember to give us a follow or a subscribe on your chosen platform. We'll see you next time.